You could argue that Jesus Christ was the first and greatest celebrity that the world had ever seen. I know lots of really big celebrities, and I know a lot of stuff about them, and then I read stuff about them which I know to be untrue. In other words, a mythology builds up around incredibly famous people over time that often bears no relation to reality, and often they don't really care if they're still alive because it all adds to the general mythology and celebrity status, and why kill a good story if you can possibly avoid it, and so on. When you read the New Testament with an historian's eye, do you see evidence of mythology creeping in where the basic tenets of Jesus of Nazareth and what happened to him and so on may well all be, to your eyes, verifiable historically, but that actually there may be mythology built up around that kind of character, and it's almost impossible to test that?
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to this argument in that I think we do see mythological drift for particular people, especially as there is a time gap between, some of the instances that we have in terms of written documentation of these individuals. I think what I would look at as a historian is when we're looking at the particulars of Jesus's life, there are things that I just don't think you would make up. I mean, even the fact that Jesus comes from the city Nazareth, it's really the boonies, for lack of a better way of putting it, of Israel. People didn't expect Jesus to come from Nazareth. They didn't expect the Messiah to be a traveling itinerant rabbi. They expected in Jesus's day, with the cultural expectation of who the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one who was predicted by particularly individuals like the prophets in the Old Testament, they expected him to be a conqueror. They expected him to come and to release the nation of Israel from under the oppression of the Romans. They did not expect the Messiah to be murdered by the Romans. And so I think if you're making up stories about him, there are particular details that we find in the New Testament and in the biographies of Jesus's life that really the only true explanation for them, I would contend, is because they actually happened. Even if you read the accounts of the biographies, the disciples really come across as pretty dumb sometimes. In fact, Jesus is teaching them and they just continue to not get what he's talking about. Ultimately, to the point where Jesus is telling them he's going to be handed over, he's going to be crucified, he's going to rise on the third day. And even his closest disciple, Peter, is saying, that's not going to happen. And he's pushing back against Jesus. And so I think in terms of what we as historians refer to as the criteria of embarrassment, women being the first eyewitnesses to the tomb in a day when women really weren't very good eyewitnesses for particular events. They weren't considered good eyewitness testimony. And we see kind of a trying to remedy that in later apocryphal documents like the Gospel of Peter, which is written in, the subsequent centuries and has no real association with the Peter of history, tries to smooth over this by having Roman and Jewish officials being the first eyewitnesses to the tomb, because whoever the author of that document was embarrassed by the fact that the historical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have women as the first eyewitnesses to the tomb. So I think if we're asking the questions of mythological drift, I also think we need to account for the fact that there are details within the New Testament that would be embarrassing if they were made up. Why would you make up embarrassing facts about the closest disciples of Jesus, about the first eyewitnesses, and even about the kind of circumstances surrounding Jesus's life, unless those were actually things that actually did happen and they're trying to be honest with the information?